Mountain peaks.
I am so frustrated. It keeps kicking me off. I'm sorry. I won't like leave the tab.
Sound of the trumpet died away. The ranchers returned to their breakfast. Louis, on his way to his first job, felt as excited as he had felt on the day he learned to fly. Chapter 11. Camp Kookooskoos.
What?
Camp Kookooskoos
What kind of a
was
name
on a
for a
small
camp
lake
is
deep in
that?
the woods of Ontario. There were no summer cottages on the lake, no outboard motors, no roads with cars rushing by. It was a wilderness lake, just right for boys. Mr. Beaver left Sam and Louie at the end of a dirt road when they finished their journey to camp by canoe. Sam sat in the stern and paddled. Louie stood in the bow and looked straight ahead. The camp consisted of a big log cabin where everybody ate, 7 tents where the boys and the counselors slept, a dock out front, and a privy out back. The woods closed in all around, but there was a bare spot that had been made into a tennis court, and there were plenty of canoes in which to take trips to other lakes. There were about 40 boys. When Sam's canoe grounded on the sandy beach next to the camp dock, Louis stepped ashore, wearing his slate, his chalk pencil, and his trumpet. About 20 boys rushed down to the landing to see what was going on. They could hardly believe their eyes. "Hey, look what's here," one of the boys yelled. "A bird," cried another. "Look at the size of him." Everybody crowded around Louis, wanting to get a close look at the new camper. Sam had to push some of the boys back to keep Louis from getting crushed. "Take it easy, will you?" Sam implored. That evening after supper, the director of the camp, Mr. Brickle, built a big campfire in front of the main lodge. The boys gathered around. They sang songs and toasted marshmallows and swatted mosquitoes. Sometimes you couldn't understand the words of the song because the boys sang with marshmallows in their mouths. Louis did not join the group. He stood by himself at a little distance. After a while, Mr. Brickle rose to his feet and addressed the boys and the counselors. "I call your attention," he said, "to a new camper in our midst, Louis the Swan. He is a trumpeter swan, a rare bird. We are lucky to have him. I have employed him at the same salary I pay my junior counselors, $100 for the season. He is gentle and has a speech defect. He came here from Montana with Sam Beaver. Louis is a musician. Like most musicians, he is in need of money. He will wake you at daybreak with his trumpet. He will call you to meals, and at night when you are dropping off to sleep, he will play taps, and that will bring the day to a close. I caution you to treat him as an equal and to treat him with respect. He packs a terrific wallop with one of those wings. I now introduce for your listening pleasure, Louis the Swan. Take a bow, Louis." Louis was embarrassed, but he came forward and bowed. Then he raised his trumpet to his mouth and blew a long coo.
That's loud.
When he finished, from the opposite shore of the lake there came the echo. The boys clapped. Louis bowed again. Sam Beaver, sitting with the others, his mouth full of marshmallows, was delighted that his plan had succeeded. At the end of the summer, Louis would have $100. A boy named Applegate Skinner stood up. "Mr. Brickle," he said, "what about me? I don't care for birds. I've never liked birds." "Okay, Applegate," said Mr. Brickle. "You don't have to like birds. If that's the way you feel about it, just go ahead not liking birds. Everyone is entitled to his likes and dislikes and to his prejudices. Come to think of it, I don't care for pistachio ice cream. I don't know why I don't like it, but I don't. Do not forget, however, that Louis is one of your counselors. Whether you like him or not, he must be treated with respect." One of the new boys, who had never been to camp before, stood up. "Mr. Brickle," he said, "why is this camp called Camp Kookooskoos? What does Kookooskoos mean?" "It's an Indian name for the great horned owl," replied Mr. Brickle. The new boy thought about this for a minute. Then why didn't you just call it Camp Great Horned Owl instead
Yo,
of
my
Camp
frame
Cuckoo
have
Squeak?
gone down so
Well,
much.
replied Mr. Brickle, a boy's camp should have a peculiar name. Otherwise, it doesn't sound interesting. Cuckoo Squeak is a terrific name. It is a long word, but it has only 3 letters in it. It has 2 S's, 3 K's, and 6 O's.
I don't
You
think
don't
this guy
find many
knows how to
names as
spell.
kooky as that. The clearer the
Cuckoo's
name, the better
Goose,
the
there's
camp.
clearly a
Anyway,
G in there.
welcome to Camp Cuckoo Squeak. It rhymes with moose. That's another good thing about it.
What? How is
And
there?
now it's time for everybody to go to bed. You may take a swim before breakfast tomorrow.
What about brushing
You
their
don't
teeth?
need to wear your swim trunks. Just jump out of bed when you hear the trumpet of the swan. Strip off your pajamas. Race to the
Imagine
dock
if
and
Louie
dive
never
in.
woke anyone
I
up.
will be there ahead of you to do my celebrated backflip from the diving tower. It freshens me up for the hard day ahead. Good night, Louie. Good night, Sam. Good night, Applegate. Good night, all. The light was fading. The boys straggled off to their tents in the darkness. The senior counselors sat together on the porch and smoked one last pipe.
Aren't
Sam
they like
crawled in
12,
under his blankets in tent
13,
3.
14?
Louis walked to a high, flat rock by the shore and stood there waiting. When the lights were all out, he faced the camp, raised his horn to his mouth, and blew taps.
Bro, this is frustrating.
The last note seemed to linger on the still waters of the lake. From their beds, the boys heard the beautiful sound. They felt sleepy and serene and happy, all but Applegate Skinner, who didn't care for birds at bedtime. But even Applegate was soon asleep, along with the others in his tent. He was asleep, and he was snoring. People who dislike birds often snore.
Well then,
A deep
everyone in my
peace
family hates
fell over
birds.
Camp Cuckoo Squeak.
My man dislikes birds.
Chapter 12. A Rescue. Louis liked to sleep on the lake.
From?
At night, after
You
blowing
say a
taps, he would
rescue.
waddle down to
I
the
don't
sandy
know about
beach
this
by
one.
the dock. There he removed his slate, his sharp pencil, and his trumpet, and hid them under a bush. Then he shoved off into the water. As soon as he was afloat, he would tuck his head under a wing. For a while he would doze and think about home and his parents. Then he would think about Serena, how beautiful she was, and how much he loved her. Pretty soon he would be
Let
fast
me end the
asleep.
part off.
When daylight came, he would swim ashore and eat a light breakfast with water plants. Then he'd put on his things, climb onto the flat rock, and blow reveille. The boys, hearing the trumpet, would wake and rush to the dock to swim before breakfast. After supper at night, the campers would often play volleyball. Louis
Lucky
loved the game.
dog.
He couldn't hop around as fast as the boys, but he could reach far out with his long neck and poke the ball into the air and over the net. It was very hard to get a ball past Louis. He could return almost any shot. When the boys chose sides at the start of the game, Louis was always the first to be chosen. The boys loved camp life in Ontario. They learned how to handle a canoe. They learned to swim. Sam Beaver took them on nature walks and taught them to sit quietly on a log and observe wild creatures and birds. He showed them how to walk in the woods without making a lot of noise. Sam showed them where the kingfisher had his nest, in a hole in the bank by a stream. He showed them the partridge and her chicks. When the boys heard a soft "co-co, co-co," Sam told them they were listening to the saw-whet owl, smallest of the owls, no bigger than a man's hand. Sometimes in the middle of the night, the whole camp would wake to the scream of a wildcat. Nobody ever saw a wildcat during the entire summer, but his scream was heard at night. One morning when Sam was playing tennis with Applegate Skinner, Sam heard a clanking noise. He looked behind him, and there, coming out of the woods, was a skunk. The skunk's head was stuck in a tin can. He couldn't see where he was going. He kept bumping into trees and rocks, and the can went clank, clank, clank.
Help him!
That skunk is in trouble, said Sam.
Finally, someone who's smart.
He's been to the dump looking for food. He poked his head into that empty can, and now he can't get it out. The word spread quickly through camp that a skunk had arrived. The boys came running to see the fun. Mr. Brickle warned them not to get too close. The skunk might squirt them with perfume. So the boys danced around, keeping their distance and holding their noses. The big question was how to get the can off the skunk's head without getting squirted. He's going to need help, said Sam. That skunk will starve to death if we don't get that can off. All the boys had suggestions. One boy said they should make a bow and arrow, tie a string to the arrow, and shoot the arrow at the can. Then when they hit the can, they could pull a string and the can would come off the skunk's head. Nobody thought much of that suggestion. It sounded like too much work. Another boy suggested that two boys climb a tree, and one boy could hang by his feet from the other boy's hands, and when the skunk walked under the tree, the boy who was hanging by his feet could reach down and pull the can off, and if the skunk squirted, the perfume wouldn't hit the boy because he would be hanging in the air. Nobody thought much of that suggestion. Mr. Brickle didn't like it at all. He said it was extremely impractical, and furthermore, he wouldn't permit it. Another boy suggested that they get a block of wood, smear it with glue, and when the skunk knocked against it, the can would stick to the block of wood. Nobody thought much of that suggestion. Mr. Brickle said he didn't have any glue anyway. While everybody was making suggestions, Sam Beaver walked quietly to his tent. He returned in a few minutes with a long pole and a piece of fish line. Sam tied one end of the fish line to the pole. Then he tied a slip knot in the other end of the line and formed a noose. Then he climbed to the roof of the porch and asked the other boys not to get too close to the skunk. The skunk all this time was blundering around, blindly bumping into things. It was a pitiful sight. Sam, holding his pole, waited patiently on the roof. He looked like a fisherman waiting for a bite. When the skunk wandered close to the building, Sam reached over, dangled the noose in front of the skunk, slipped the noose around the can, and gave a jerk. The noose tightened, and the can came off. As it did so, the skunk turned around and squirted right at Mr. Brickle, who jumped back, stumbled, and fell. All the boys danced around, holding their noses. The skunk ran off into the woods. Mr. Brickle got up and dusted himself off. The air smelled strong of skunk. Mr. Brickle smelled too. Congratulations, Sam, said Mr. Brickle. You have aided a wild creature and have given Camp Coos a delicious dash of wild perfume. I'm sure we'll all remember this malodorous
The sarcasm is
for a
surreal.
long time to come. I don't see how we can very well forget it. Ho-ho! Cried Louie, lifting his trumpet. The lake echoed with the sound. The air was heavy with a rich, musky smell of skunk. The boys danced, holding their noses. Some of them held their stomachs and pretended to throw up. Then Mr. Brickle announced it was time for the morning swim. A swim will clear the air, he said as he walked away toward his cottage to change his clothes.
One lap around the
After lunch each day, the campers went to their tents for a rest period.
It's not. I'm
Some
going
of
to
them
be
read
very,
books.
very surprised.
Some wrote letters home, telling their parents how bad the food was. Some just lay on their cots and talked.
Okay.
One afternoon during the rest
If I
period,
make it back to
the boys in Applegate's tent began teasing him about his name. Applegate Skinner, said one boy. Where did you get such a crazy name, Applegate? My parents gave it to me, replied Applegate.
Sick brain.
I know what his name is, said another boy. Sour Applegate. Sour Applegate Skinner. The boys howled at this and began chanting, Sour Applegate, Sour Applegate, Sour Applegate. Quiet, bellowed the tent leader. I don't think it's funny, said Applegate. His name isn't Sour Applegate, whispered another boy. His name is Wormy Applegate. Wormy Applegate Skinner. The This suggestion was greeted with screams of laughter. "Quiet!" bellowed the tent leader. "I want quiet in this tent. Leave Applegate alone." "Leave rotten Applegate alone," whispered another boy. And some of the other boys had to pull their pillows over their heads so their snickering couldn't be heard. Applegate was sore. When the rest period was over, he wandered down to the dock. He didn't like being made fun of, and he wanted to do something to get even. Without saying anything to anybody, he slid a canoe into the water and paddled out into the lake, heading for the opposite shore a mile away. No one noticed him. Applegate had no business taking a canoe out alone. He had not passed his swimming test. He had not passed his canoe test. He was disobeying a camp rule. When he was a quarter of a mile from shore, in deep water, the wind grew stronger. The waves got higher. The canoe was hard to manage. Applegate got scared. Suddenly a wave caught the canoe and spun it around. Applegate leaned hard on his paddle. His hand slipped and he lost his balance. The canoe tipped over. Applegate found himself in the water. His clothes felt terribly soggy and heavy. His shoes